Hi, so I'd like to welcome our viewers to Phenomenology of the Phenomenon. This is a series where we discuss the application of the philosophical tradition of phenomenology to the study of unidentified aerial or anomalous phenomena and close encounters. The series is produced by the Society for UAP Studies, and I am the host, Kimberly Engels. I'm very excited about my guest today, Dr. Jim Madden from Benedictine College. Jim, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thanks for having me, Kim. Appreciate it.
All right. So Dr. Jim Madden is as I said, he's a professor of philosophy at Benedictine College. He earned his PhD from Purdue University, and his research is primarily in philosophy of mind, philosophy of religion, metaphysics, and recently psychoanalysis. He is the author of Mind, Matter, and Nature, Thinking About Thinking, and Unidentified Flying Hyperoject. And it's his most recent book, Unidentified Flying Hyperobject. You can see it sometimes with the screen, it's not so good. But that is what we will be discussing the ideas in this text today. So Jim, before I dive into, I usually have a little spiel I do about what is phenomenology as a method, and I'm going to dive into that in a second. But I'd like to just start with understanding a little bit about, what led you as a philosopher to become interested in the UFO phenomenon in a philosophical way, and to want to produce serious philosophical research on this topic. I think that's worth diving into.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, partly for me is, sort of philosophy, and you're probably the same way, Kim, it's sort of like my immune system defense mechanism for everything, right? So like, this is just how I approach everything in the world and in my personal life, which probably drives my wife and children batty. Okay, but so partly is if I'm gonna deal with something, it's gonna be through a philosophical lens, right? But so I mention this a lot when I talk about this particular topic is, I wasn't really interested in the UFO until, like a lot of other people, until like 2017, right? When suddenly, it's kind of sort of being acknowledged by, government authority after that. And, we have the famous Tic Tac stuff and all the Joe Rogan stuff. And it led me to actually look into some of the literature surrounding it. And I was, pleasantly surprised by how good some of that literature is, especially Jacques Vallée and John Keel and some others. And that led me to think, well, this is worth looking into. And so I began reading really broadly. Initially, I thought it was, as far as philosophy went, I saw it as mostly it was going to be an epistemological issue. It was going to be about the weighing of evidence. It was going to be, can we put this up against Hume's standards, in his arguments against belief in miracles, that sort of thing. And the further I got into it, and I think that's because I like a lot of people, just took the surface pop culture story about it pretty seriously. It's extraterrestrial, and so like the whole notion of what kind of object we're talking about here went unquestioned, right? And then there's this like kind of basic popular culture answer to it. But then once I got into some of the literature and I saw there's an open question as to like, what, if this is true, what it is. Okay, so and so then that led me, as someone more inclined towards philosophy of mind and metaphysics, to think, oh wait, this is a little close to my philosophical wheelhouse. And that it's raising questions like, what is an object? What is our relationship to objects as cognizing beings? And interestingly, really overlapped with work I was doing independently of all this. Okay, so that's how I got into it. And I say this a lot now is, even if like tomorrow, we just somehow turns out there's no such thing as the UFO, or whatever reason I became convinced of that. I think everything I did in the book would still stand as a sort of thought experiment in metaphysics. And so I think like the very proposal of the UFO is this incredible way of like discussing our limitations cognitively and like what are the possibilities for something to be, that for me now it's just this very exciting thought experiment. Though I do take the reality of it very seriously.
That's really interesting, actually, because I think you're correct. Thinking about the arguments as you unpack them in this book, even if they definitively came out tomorrow with empirical evidence and said, oh, it was, we've realized that it was just traditional objects all along. The metaphysical exercises that you do in this book are still worthwhile and still, the book wouldn't, be outdated or something like that. So,
Yeah.
so that's pretty, that's pretty substantial, feat
So.
in terms of producing a work of research. Sorry, go ahead.
I think it dovetails maybe with what you do as sort of a more traditional phenomenologist, is that you're bracketing the reality and you're just asking, how does this show up in consciousness? What implications does it have for our consciousness going forward, right? And whether, so I'm kind of operating in the bracket too, right? And and so whatever goes on outside the bracketing, this shows up for some of us, at least. It hasn't shown up for me, but for a lot of people that I think are very reliable, it does show up for them in consciousness. It does have implications for them within consciousness. And I think it has implications for what consciousness is, right? Which interests me about it. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. So I think that's a good segue into talking about the phenomenology, right? So for our viewers, I go over this every episode, but it's important. Just a little brief definition of what phenomenology is. And then we'll start diving into the arguments in the book and how they relate to phenomenology. So phenomenology is a philosophical method that's rooted in the rigorous examination of first-person consciousness. Husserl was the founder of phenomenology, and he advocated a method of bracketing, which Jim just mentioned, in which we suspend judgment on the source or origin of what is being interacted with, and we describe what appears, or what's given to consciousness. So a phenomenological analysis involves describing exactly what appears to the individual, as well as how what appears is received, organized, and classified by the conscious subject. With phenomenology, we have to be very careful about describing exactly how an object is presented to consciousness. Is it a perceptual object? Is it a remembered object? Is it an imagined object? While the scientific method is focused on collecting physical evidence that can be objectively verified in controlled conditions, the phenomenological method rigorously examines the experience of the witness, what they saw, heard, sensed, felt, and formed judgments about. So that's kind of my, brief spiel on phenomenology. Would you, I always ask, is there anything that you would personally want to add to that in your own engagement with the phenomenological tradition?
No, I think that is a really good summary.
Okay.
Yeah, very good. Excellent. I'll say this is, it's interesting, and just, based on our conversation so far and your interview with Michael Zimmerman, it seems you're working phenomenologically really from Husserl forward, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'll say this, and this doesn't necessarily mean we're at odds, but it's sort of different. So for me, I'm working through phenomenology, like, and you can tell this in the book, division 1 of being in time, right? And also Merleau-Ponty, especially the later stuff. Okay. And I think, though, in those two traditions, I think maybe we're a little less disciplined about the bracket than maybe in other types. But do you agree or not? Yeah.
No, completely. So I'll make a comment on that because I think it's important. Because I also engage, Merleau-Ponty, and actually my figure that I've done the most work with is Sartre.
Okay.
And with Heidegger as well, it's kind of becomes existential phenomenology in that we start engaging, what is the meaning that these experiences also have for the subject, and how do they integrate the meaning of those experiences into their understanding of the life world, right?
Right.
So yeah, that very intense bracketing that Husserl advocated for, with some of these more existential phenomenologists such as Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, they start exploring that question of meaning, right? And understanding that the subject is always bringing meaning to the encounter and projecting value and meaning in terms of what they organize, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Specifically, what I had in mind was Merleau-Ponty's preface to the Phenomenology of Perception, where he says, here's what Husserl says phenomenology is, and he's like, yeah, I agree, but for me, it begins in existence, right? It begins in facticity in a way, and so he starts already kind of grounded, right? And I don't know if we're going too far in the weeds here, but it's interesting to think about, and I'm interested in your view on this. Do you see that as departing from the Husserl of the crisis of European sciences?
That's a good question.
Like I'm holding this in a bad place, I don't know, but yeah.
I think it's building on, I think it's expanding on what he introduces there, because he'd come quite a long way in crisis than he had from, some of these earlier texts. And he is talking about that the subject is integrated in a life world. But I think, Merleau-Ponty and Sartre take it a step further. I'd call it maybe more of an expanded framework than a departure. But I think you're bringing up an important point here that it's important to emphasize for the viewer, is that, phenomenology refers to a tradition of thinkers who examine first-person consciousness and kind of how objects are given to consciousness. But there's not necessarily agreement from all of them, because this is philosophy, right? And so it's got like Husserl introduced the method, and then we've got Heidegger, building on it in his way and saying Husserl was wrong about this, and Merleau-Ponty, saying, well, the initial the link between the individual and the world is the body. We find with Merleau-Ponty, and then Sartre really bringing in, he talks about the freedom and the projection of value. So there's not necessarily a singular phenomenological approach. There's kind of a group of thinkers who refer to themselves as phenomenologists because they're studying consciousness through the first person, who deviate or expand on Husserl's frameworks accordingly, as philosophers do.
Yeah, 100%.
Excellent. So I like where this is going already.
Yeah.
Well, wait. So let's turn to the book a little bit.
Yeah. Sure.
I really enjoyed this. First of all, thank you. It was a very rigorous, philosophically disciplined analysis of, a lot of these were things I had thought about before, but you really put it into language that I thought made it very accessible. And sometimes that's half the battle when constructing a philosophical analysis is, how exactly do I describe this? Or how do I frame this argument with the right language? So one concept that you make use of in this book is the concept of the Umwelt. Mm-hmm. And so I would like you to just tell our viewers a little bit, what is the Umwelt? How do you make use of that? Well, we'll dive in more to the whole hypothesis you have, Uber-Umwelt Terrestrial Hypothesis. So let's start with just what is an organism's Umwelt, first of all? Sure. And then how is it relevant to phenomenology?
Sure, I appreciate that. So first of all, thank you for the comments on the book. And when you say like kind of it in the book, I'm taking some very complicated stuff and make it accessible. I think you'll agree. This is what 20 years of teaching undergraduates will actually make you good at. Right. Okay, so the Umwelt is this notion that is it's a concept that shows up in early 20th century behavioral biology. It's a concept that you see it all over early phenomenology, especially Heidegger, right, in Being and Time. You see it now in a lot of the sort of neurophenomenology that's going on in some interesting circles in contemporary cognitive science and philosophy of mind. It's sort of where I got to it. People like Andy Clark, who's a very influential contemporary cognitive scientist, trades in this notion quite a bit. It can be translated as environment. Very often it is. I know, like a lot of the translations of Heidegger's Being and Time is translated as environment. I decided to leave it as Umwelt because I think by translating environment, it's going to have connotations for us now that I think would be unfortunate. All right. And my German isn't good enough to have my own novel translation, so I just left it as Umwelt. Okay, but literally in the German, it would mean the around world or the world about us or something like that. And so and the idea is every organism has an Umwelt. And you'll even hear later phenomenologists, I think Merleau-Ponty will even say this, is the organism creates an environment for itself. Okay, now that sounds like what we're talking about here is some kind of idealism, where, we dream the world into existence. And actually, it really couldn't be further from that. I read it, I'm interested to hear your view on this, Kim, as a kind of very serious realism, not idealism. Okay. And then that might be the triple O thing sneaking in there too. But so the famous example of this, Clark uses it. It's the original example that Uexküll uses, is the idea of a tick. Okay. And there's a certain kind of tick that only has three like components to its sensory system. Okay. So this tick it can sense differences in temperature in its immediate vicinity. It can sense surface tension, so it knows when it's landed on something. And it can sense, to a very, very fine grain, the amount of, I think it's butyric acid. It's the acid that mammals emit from their skin. It can sense that in its environment. And with just these three, now keep in mind, you have a tick hanging on a blade of grass or a branch, everything else going on in the world around it, the colors, the sounds, the smells, everything else going on, that tick, it's not even aloof to it. Those things do not exist for it. There has no access to that whatsoever. Its world is solely composed of the surface tensions, the heat differences, and the butyric acid in the environment. That's it. But yet with just those three senses, that tick can time its jump on you as you walk by it. And can very quickly find where the nearest blood vessel is to your skin and go in and start sucking the blood. Okay. So is the tick getting things right? I would say, yeah, it is. Like, when I walk by it, it's getting me right. I really do emit butyric acid. I really do have temperature differences on the surface of my skin, and I really can be landed on. Okay. So the tick is getting the world right there, but its way of getting it right only works by taking this indefinite, maybe infinite possibility for perception and narrowing it way down to something manageable, right? And there's this interplay between the evolutionary history of the tick and the available opportunities for perception that have sort of now given us this package, right, of perceptual possibilities linked to perceptual apparatus in the tick, such that now the tick has a coherent, consistent, very pragmatically effective Umwelt, an environment for it that it exists in, of, I would say, real things, like actually existing things that it has access to. Okay, great. But then note that entails, and this isn't always, I think, explored in the phenomenological tradition, I think it should be, right? That entails that there's a vast, what I'll call Uber-Umwelt, and a super around world. We're kind of playing on Kreipel here. There's a super around world that of all these things that are out there that the tick is aloof to. And I find it very interesting that the way perception works is it enables by limiting. Like the thing we can only perceive by limiting the options for perception. All right. And so thereby we're always leaving more behind than we're bringing in. Okay. And then the next move to see is that we're no different than the tick. We see in a certain wavelength of light, we hear, a certain wavelengths of sound. There are certain smells that we can get, but we're not terribly good at that one, right? There's certain textures we can pick up, but really not very good at that, really, and et cetera, et cetera. And so now our cognition, which is going to be tied with our perception, no less than the ticks, is limited, and it's a caricature of what's out there. I think we're getting real stuff. I'm not an idealist. I think we really do have access to a real world, but there's a vast Uber-Umwelt of other possibilities, of, I should say, other actualities that we are utterly aloof to. Okay, and I think once you get that, the way I've begun to recently put it, you should not be surprised that we're surprised. Right? You should not be surprised that occasionally we can kind of bump into something that doesn't fit, right? That doesn't make sense, because our sense making really is not the measure of what's out there.
Yeah, I think this is so interesting. I mean, and to answer your question, about the idealism versus realism, I think you're correct. I think it is a form of realism, because you are coming in, or we are coming into contact with real objects. When I, sense the objects in this room, or I sense the tree outside my window, that is something that's there. But I'm pulling from, as you said, a much wider, a much vaster field of possible sensory perception that's out there. Only that which is going to make sense through my faculties, as well as, Kant said, the categories of our understanding. We're kind of processing it through that. And, you said we were really no different than the tick, being that our sensory faculties, our brain, yes, it's giving us information that's true enough for us to anchor ourselves in physical reality and, survive, right? It's, tailored to kind of our needs and what is relevant to us in order for us to have a physical experience. But much like the tick, there could be a lot going on there in the Uber-Umwelt that we're simply filtering out, right? And I think your point, we shouldn't be surprised that we're surprised, is really important. And you have this example in the book that I think is interesting. You talk about the sharks Umwelt and how, they're down there in the depths of the ocean and they very rarely come into contact with us. But when they do, all of a sudden there's a person down there in a shark cage, and that must be just as bewildering in a sense to them, or it must be just as much out there or not in congruence with their Umwelt as, seeing a UFO or a UAP is to us, right? Or, some type of entity, or the various things that people come into contact with. All of a sudden something that's always existed there, but your environment, your Umwelt, your paths just don't cross that often until all of a sudden, there is something from that vast out there that suddenly makes itself presentable to us.
Exactly. Yeah, you're getting me 100%. And think of the shark. Okay, the shark is, it's got to kind of stay in its lane. It's not a technological animal in the way we are, and so the shark is far less likely to be surprised by something because it doesn't get out of its lane. Whereas, we can get out of the lane that we were directly evolved to be in. We're flying now. We're using the internet now, and so it's really, in the human case, we should not be surprised, especially in the last century, that we started bumping into stuff that we had never fathomed before.
That's another really important point, right? Like, we had the extension of our senses through our instruments. And then, as you said, these new technologies, we found ourselves in the air, we find ourselves in the bottom of the sea, like places that evolutionarily we shouldn't be. And yes, so it makes sense that, we started having contact, or we started, as you said, kind of bumping into the edges of something that we didn't have contact with before. I really feel affirmed, Kim, by some of the things you said here, because I think, especially in the UFO conversation, there is this very quick move to idealism. Okay. And as soon as we admit that there's any kind of relativity to perception at all, okay, I'm going to say like the dangerous R word, like there's some relativity to perception at all, there's this jump to then, it's all in our heads. Okay, well, I think there's a false dichotomy at work there. Is if we can admit, like, we could admit that the human condition, what makes the possibility for human perception, concrete, like just because we say we can't get outside of the conditions of our perceiving, doesn't mean we don't have a contact with the real. Okay, it doesn't commit us to this sort of like really, really extreme correlationism, right? And I think that's an important point, because you do see these jumps to like very, very extreme forms of idealism all over the discussion of the paranormal. And I think there's a middle ground there that we can occupy. No, I think that's such an important point. And I've brought that exact, phrasing, I say sometimes it's really a false dichotomy. It's like, yeah. I think in a lot of ways, the standard kind of physicalist, purely materialist version of the world, where, the cause and effect model is kind of all that there is, it doesn't fit. But then it's also kind of positing the opposite, jumping all the way to idealism, and just kind of the perception or the mental is then all that there is also not it either. Like that doesn't quite fit either. And that's kind of, it's posed as like an either or. And I think that's something that the UFO phenomenon shows us is transcending that duality or transcending that dichotomy and showing us that it's more likely that the answer lies somewhere in between. And that it's really kind of helping us unpack those, very rigid binaries or dichotomies that we try to project onto this situation. So yeah, 100%. I'm in the same boat. I think, as you said, the answer lies somewhere in between, right? Our perception does shape our experience, and consciousness, I think, does interact with matter in ways that are much more nuanced than we currently understand. But again, that doesn't mean that the mental is all there is, that we shift to idealism, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I sort of have Hegelian intuitions in some of this, and like, I just think the material without a determinate contradictory isn't an explanatory concept anymore, right? If something is predicate of everything, then I wonder to what degree it's a predicate at all. Well, likewise, the immaterial, the mental, if we say that's just predicated of everything, right, then I wonder in what sense we actually have an informative predication there at all, right? So I'm sort of wary of monisms, right?
I think that's really interesting, actually. Yeah, if everything is material, then again, it ceases to be a predicate. It ceases to be any type of a property. And same thing with the mental. I think that's actually, I haven't heard that framing before, and I think that's a really important point. And I think, again, like, we want to overcome, as I said, these dichotomies or these dualities or binaries that we're thinking, but also, these reductionism, trying to reduce everything to one property or one predicate, as you said, is also problematic. Like, we tend to want to do that, I think, because it's simpler, and we want, fewer categories rather than more. But we're losing something when we do that, right? And when we're not following, what is actually being shown to us.
Agreed.
Excellent. All right, so I'm already very excited, as I said, about where this has gone. So okay, we've got the Umelt. We've got like us who are here with our five senses. Some people have more of a developed sixth sense, perhaps. But pretty limited in terms of evolutionarily what we actually take in. And it's possible, as you say, with the UFO phenomenon, we're bumping into something that is part of the Uber-Umwelt, that kind of vast area of sense experience or potential sensory experience that we just don't normally have access to. So you develop in this book what you call the Uber-Umwelt Terrestrial Hypothesis, okay? And you put this up as a alternative to the standard extraterrestrial hypothesis. And before we dive into your Uber-Umwelt Terrestrial Hypothesis, the UUTH, I want to talk a little bit about the ETH, because the idea, as you mentioned this earlier, it's so very deeply ingrained that UFO equals extraterrestrial, that or it's either extraterrestrial or it's nothing, right? Or it's either it can be explained as just mundane traditional objects, mistakes, or we're dealing with extraterrestrial spacecraft. And that's kind of the only two options. So when I tell people I'm interested in UFOs or unidentified aerial phenomena, you're interested in aliens, thinking aliens is in the extraterrestrial. And I say, well, no, I'm interested in unidentified aerial phenomena. And, that includes encounters with potential non-human intelligences or traditional non-human intelligences, but not necessarily the, aliens in the ways that people mean that when they say it, So what are some of the shortcomings of the ETH, the extraterrestrial hypothesis? What are aspects of the phenomenon that really don't fit? And, in particular, if we could discuss this through, phenomenologically, in terms of how the things that people report as appearing to them really don't fit with the ETH. At least some of them don't, right? So some of them really kind of stray far from what we'd think of if these are just space, investigators from another planet who have flown down here on their spaceships. Yeah. For example, and I'll let you take it where you want to, but you mentioned this very strange encounter in the Strieber letters, it involved a strange airplane, a billboard, and some clowns on the side of the road in terms of what appeared to the individual. So we can go down that road if you want, but just in general, what is it about the ETH what are the shortcomings? Why doesn't it fit?
Sure. Okay, so first of all, I like to refer to myself as a recovering analytic philosopher. Okay, so most of my training in grad school was in analytic philosophy, and I'm a bit of a dilettante. Okay, and so especially in philosophy of religion with the problem of evil. Okay, in the analytic discussion of the problem of evil, it's all about the weighing of probabilities now. Like it's all getting like dumped into base theorems. So we agree supposedly on a background set of plausibilities, and then we weigh the two hypotheses against that take into account that background. Okay. And so when I initially got into the UFO question, when I saw people like Jacques Vallée making similar moves as that in discussing the extraterrestrial hypothesis, that really resonated with me. And so Vallée will point out that, okay, if you say it's extraterrestrial, you have to now add to our hypothesis for explanation here question of how likely it is that something could travel intergalactically and get here, right? And then also not only like a one-timer, but it seems like there's hundreds of thousands of these events that have happened, in the last, 70, 80 years. Okay. So now what's happened here is like you let's say you could assign a certain probability to just there being visitation, okay, of some sort. Now add to it that it's intergalactic. Well, you've now complicated the hypothesis, and then like the mathematics just took the probability of that down, right? Now multiply that visitation by tens of thousands, or the probability just went down, okay? And then you have this fact, and I think this is more to where you were looking to go, Kim, and I agree, that when experiencers report what they're encountering, especially from the seemingly living organisms associated with this, they tend to be bipedal. They tend to, walk upright. They tend to have eyes in the front of their head. They tend to breathe our air in some ways, right? They tend to be able to hear in the same frequency of sound that we hear, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, there's some argument to be made that if you ran evolution again on planet Earth, you would still get something about like us. That's controversial. Some people will claim that. But I don't think we have any reason to believe you would get bipedal, forward-looking, rational animals that evolved under very different conditions from us on a different planet. So like right there, what's the probability of that? And so my worry about the extraterrestrial hypothesis is among the going hypotheses, it may be the least probable one, okay? At least if you could go with one of the ultra-terrestrial hypotheses or one of these like Michael Masters, what is it, the future tempestrial hypotheses where it's humans from the future, you take the time, you take the space travel thing out of it, you take the how likely is it for something to evolve like us out of it, and your probability goes up. Okay. So I just think in general, by making like at least entertaining the possibility that what we're dealing with is another organism from planet Earth, you've really helped the probabilistic credentials of the hypothesis quite a bit. Okay. So, and I think if we are actually making a proposal for empirical science here, that's important. Okay. So that to me is like, I think fairly decisive, right? As decisive as anything where we're weighing probabilities can be. Okay. But I think now another more important from a phenomenological standpoint is, you mentioned something like this case of that Whitley Strieber recounts in his book, Them, where you have two independent witnesses who didn't know each other on a busy freeway somewhere in the New York City area, I believe it was, in like the 1970s, 1980s, both of whom saw what appeared to be something like a jet airliner, but off. It wasn't quite right. It was oddly proportioned or whatever, about to crash in the highway, but no one else sees it. Okay. And then they both reported some kind of encounter with this maniacal circus of like ill-behaved clowns and a billboard taking off into space, or not in space, just taking off. Okay. And that's a case where it's so bizarre. It doesn't fit any of the classic, Steven Spielberg presentations of what the phenomenon is. And what's interesting is they see it, but no one else does. And they have no contact with each other. So the fact that they report it independently is, I think, evidentially significant. Right. And the fact that no one else sees it but them, I think, is ontologically significant. Because it seems like it's a phenomenon now that is plain by different behavior than just, the ordinary cup on my desk right now. All right. In that we can't count on every observer in the room to get it. Okay. So I think right there, when you see how the fact that the phenomenon seems to be polymorphous in a single appearance, okay, is ontologically significant. And I think as soon as you get that, and this is, and Kim, because you've looked at the cases too, this is that aspect of it is not anomalous among these anomalies. Like there's a lot of these where it's polymorphous under a single appearance among independent witnesses. That's very important, because I think that tells us it's ontologically very ill-behaved compared to our normal categories, which then as soon as we start saying, well, it's extraterrestrial and it's animals like us, you're putting into very familiar categories as our own, but it doesn't seem to be behaving like anything that we normally categorize. And so that's where I think the phenomenology here is a real tip against at least a naive acceptance of the extraterrestrial hypothesis.
Yeah, I've said before, I don't completely rule out, and I think Strieber says this in one of his works, maybe it's The Supernatural, he says, I don't think it's impossible that maybe some of these visitors or, this phenomena could have had origins, on other planets. But he says, even if that is the case, it's just far from the whole story, because they seem to be, as you said, to be playing by different ontological rules than physical reality. So, even if they are, potentially had an evolutionary history from a planet other than Earth, as you said, that leads to, probability issues. But even if, that's in the realm of possibility, there's something else going on here. There's so much more, to these encounters that's pointing at, they're intertwined with us in ways that we don't understand, but they also play by, different rules than physical reality. As you said, it's not uncommon for there to be, a group of people who see a UFO and several of them see it and several of them don't, or they see the UFO and some of them see an entity standing there next to it and some of them don't. Another thing that was really interesting in terms of the phenomenology, and we talk about kind of strikes against the extraterrestrial hypothesis. I studied the Strieber letters last summer at the Rice University archives there.
I just got to go there last month. It's incredible.
It is. Yes, it is. And this was a point that, Whitley Strieber brought up, his wife Anne Strieber brought up, is that many of these accounts, there's the supposed alien visitors who are there. And quite often, as you say, they look and behave in ways that are very strange in terms of how you would expect an extraterrestrial to act, first of all. But they also are seen alongside apparitions of the dead, right? This is something that just has not been mentioned. And I'm not, again, jumping to any conclusion about what that means. I brought that up in a casual conversation once, and somebody says, oh, so you're saying that, they're all ghosts? And I said, no, I wasn't saying that at all. I'm really looking at how does that make sense in terms of the extraterrestrial hypothesis? Why would there be an apparition of the dead alongside these supposed visitors from, Zeta Reculi or whatever? That just doesn't add up, and we could talk about various, Strieber has some hypotheses of why, in his book, A New World, he talks about why he thinks they often show up together, and we could speculate on, those reasons. But when we're looking at the phenomenology, if we're going to take eyewitness accounts seriously, and I think that we should, because with, the content of these, and especially as you said, many of them are verified. That particular one you were talking about, those were two individuals who did not consult with each other, and then described a very similar account.
One of them was a perceptual psychologist too. I think that's important.
What was that?
One of them was a perceptual psychologist also.
Okay. Right. Yeah. Many of these people are very, not fantasy prone in any normal sense, right? If we're going to take it seriously, we have to take it seriously. Everything that they're saying appears, even when it isn't convenient for the extraterrestrial hypothesis, right? There's some folks who take UFOs seriously, but they're very committed to the ETH. And so these aspects of eyewitness testimony that don't line up with the ETH, kind of the default is to just kind of, let's not talk about that, let's, leave that out. But I think, if we're going to say, we're talking about ways that the phenomenon manifests in experience, this is part of the way that it manifests in experience. And, it doesn't quite add up, or it doesn't, in my mind, line up with the idea that these are just, as we said, advanced space travelers from another planet who have flown here and are visiting us.
Yeah. It's ill-behaved to all categories. It really is. So this is work in cognitive science I encountered since I published the book. If there's a second edition, this will be in there. But Andy Clark's most recent book is called The Experience Machine. And he's defending this general thesis that a lot of psychologists and neuroscientists and cognitive scientists are making about the predictive model of perception and cognition too. And so some of the literature, some of the modeling of how things work at neurological levels in perception actually have they've started to gravitate to this notion that in some visual perceptions, the amount of outgoing information pathways as opposed to incoming information pathways in your nervous system are 4-to-1 favoring outgoing. Yeah. Isn't that? Yeah, it's in Clark's Experience Machine. He cites the literature on it. And so what goes on here is basically what happens is and this will make sense to anyone who thinks there's the slightest shred of truth in Kant, right? Is we don't just open our eyes up and innocently take in information. Okay. We open our eyes up and it looks like the brain throws a prediction out there. Because here's what I'm used to seeing in this situation. And the brain throws a prediction out there. And then the brain basically wants to maintain that prediction unless it really, really has to amend it. Because if it's the prediction, it means it worked well in the past. Okay. So you throw a prediction out there, and what sense perception does is it disconfirms the prediction. And so the brain then will revise the prediction on the fly, but only when it has to. Okay. And so now imagine you open your eyes up and you throw your prediction out there, and there's something just utterly outside of all your previous predictions. Okay. And we kind of know the brain does this. It'll just take something from the inventory and throw it at that. Okay. There's evidence that this may be how placebos work. You're expecting not to feel pain now, so you just interpret out the pain, and you interpret in, because both perceptions are there, but you interpret one out, you interpret one in. Okay. But what if you get something that just utterly it's from the Uber-Umwelt? There's no previous human prediction for this. Well, we're going to grab anything. We're going to take anything from our predictive toolbox and we're throw it on that. Okay. So it makes sense that because I'm horrified by maniacal clowns, say. It makes sense that if I see something in Uber-Umwelt, I throw the maniacal clown thing on it. Okay. What's odd, though, in a case is, well, why would two people do that, right, in the same situation? So now it's okay, it seems like there's something objective going on here. Okay. But now, so that means we need to pay very close attention to what the experiencer is telling us. Okay. But yet, since we know humans it looks like we kind of want to maintain our predictions, we're going to throw something from previous predictions on there. I think now we have to really now kind of I like to call this hermeneutics of subtraction. Try to really look at, this is I think part of the role of the phenomenologist, look at what's being reported and try to really get a sense of what's in that is really just more of the human, being put on something, and what might be the non-human that we can excavate from that. Okay. So I think given what we know about how our cognition works, I think, but now given that there's reason to think that a lot of these experiences are in a sense objective, that means I do think there is a need for serious phenomenological psychoanalytic excavation on these experiences to try to figure out what is just more of our human noise being put on that, as opposed to what something else from us is showing up there, right? Because I could see, yeah, look, something really hits me, I know what to do, and I just interpret it as my long lost grandfather, right? Because I've already got ghosts in the tool, but that doesn't mean that it's false. But you see what I mean? So I think we need to like really look at that stuff and be disciplined. Take none of it at face value, okay? So that we can try to separate out the human contribution from this to get what may be the non-human contribution.
No, I think that's really wise. Another aspect of that same phenomenon that you're talking about is there's a lot of, they've started to call them screen memories.
Yeah.
As in, like, they often see, like an owl, or like Terry Mullis, this chemist had a very famous account where he saw a glowing raccoon, looked at him and said, "Hello, doctor." And again, I think that he encountered, as you said, something objective. That was an interesting account, because I think it was the next night, he had guests at a party, and another of them reported seeing like a glowing talking raccoon. So that was another one where there was two witnesses who didn't speak to each other, and who both saw something that for some reason, their brain, again, maybe their brain just kind of threw that prediction out there, didn't know what to make of what it actually was encountering. So it was like, oh, that's a raccoon. But it's strange that both of their brains interpreted it that way, right? So it's like, is there a reason that it's showing up, as an owl or as a raccoon? A kangaroo is another one that I found in the Strieber letters was kind of common. Rather than, again, something from the Uber-Umwelt that the brain doesn't fully know what to do with.
A lot of times people will talk about this under the description, like the absurdity of the phenomenon, right? Like, why would it show up as a raccoon? It seems so silly, right? Why would it show up as a kangaroo? Why would it show up as my grandfather or whatever? But I'm trying to make the case that the absurdity might be on our side, not it, right? It's because we're throwing whatever the human has to throw at it to make sense of it. Now, though, it is curious, like, why would two people both see it as the glowing raccoon, but still we do have like the raccoon in our cognitive memory and all that, right? So I think that's important. And I want to be very careful. I am not reducing the experiencer's experience. I'm actually trying to take it very, very seriously, but admit like what we know about how humans operate in extreme cognitive circumstances.
Yeah, take it seriously, but try to parse out, again, was this something that was part of how the object was actually presented, or was this something that the human mind was imposing onto it because it just didn't know how to make sense of it?
Yeah.
I hadn't encountered something like that before.
100%. And I'd love to hear your view on this, because I get asked, and I bet you get asked all the time. So, are UFOs angels? Are UFOs demons, or something like that? And whatever my religious commitments might be, like I say, is water H2O or is H2O water? I mean, there are problems with identity claims. We can get into logical identity, which is a nasty place to go. But also, just like it seems. The thing to see here is if indeed this is something from beyond our Uber-Umwelt, then we can't take any of our kind of knee-jerk interpretations of it at face value. In the end, maybe, but we can't take them at face value. We have to we've got to do some hermeneutics of suspicion on this stuff. And even those of us who are open to the truth of it, I think we do need to do the hermeneutics of suspicion here. And that's why I think this is why the humanities, the social sciences, phenomenology, psychoanalysis, anthropology, neuroscience, cognitive science, I think they really do need to become kind of the lead disciplines in this.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I got asked this just like a week ago. Somebody was bringing up the angels, UFOs connection. And, I was saying, I think it's very possible that some of the things that people have interpreted as angels in the past are what we are now interpreting as, UFOs or extraterrestrials, or vice versa. Some of the things people may have interpreted as demons in the past, we're now interpreting as extraterrestrials. And, that's something that Vallée really, I thought, did a great job pointing out, when he did really a phenomenological analysis of like the Fatima miracle, he says, okay, everyone saw, 50,000 or 80,000, I don't remember, people witnessed the Virgin Mary, come down from when the sun fell out of the sky. But she was riding on the same technology that the alleged extraterrestrials are using as well. She uses the same UFO technology, and he talks about how the sounds that they reported, the way that it fell out of the sky was very similar to UFO reports. The shape, the way that everything was dry, that was part of the miracle, is that nobody was wet. It was raining, but nobody was wet. And again, that's been reported with UFOs, quite commonly. So, there are these experiences, and they defy our categories of understanding. They just defy the ability of our brains to make complete sense of it. And then there's this framework of interpretation that we put on top of it. And I think it's very possible that, some of the things that we've classified as religious miracles or apparitions of, Virgin Mary or other, sacred religious figures could be the same thing that we're interacting with now and understanding as UFOs, or as aliens or ETs or whatever. But it's just the framework of interpretation that we're imposing onto it, or the framework of meaning, is different.
Yeah, agreed. And so, and to be clear, and I think this is part of your point, Kim, is that people hear that when I've taught that book, people will hear that. So you're saying that the appearance of Fatima was a flying saucer? No one's saying that. What's being said here is what people report as flying saucers and what people report as appearances of the Blessed Mother, right, are phenomenologically seemingly almost identical experiences. That is not to privilege either of the mythological interpretations one over the other, right? And you, it's sort of like, well, when eventually when people found out that the morning star is the evening star, right? They didn't privilege one of those descriptions over the other. It turns out they're both this third thing, the planet Venus, right? And so there's this other option there. Like, yeah, one, and hey, maybe a case can be made that the Blessed Mother interpretation is the better one, or the flying saucer one is the better one. That's one way we could kind of solve it ontically that way, I guess would be a way to put it. Or maybe there's an ontological thing that's happening here, where that there's a third thing, an unknown category to us, that they're both manifestations of, the way Venus turned out to be a new thing on the scene for people once we discovered the morning star is the evening star.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction, right? I'm not saying that, it was really just, UFOs and aliens that took place at Fatima. But as you said, phenomenologically, what appeared there is very similar to what's appeared in these other circumstances. And it may be the case that, all of these can be explained by something that we just haven't stumbled upon yet, right? Right. It'll eventually become clearly, or it'll become clear what the ontology of this actually was.
We hope.
Perhaps.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah.
So we've talked about this a little bit, but actually a lot, but you formally you call it the Uber-Umwelt Terrestrial Hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
So just say a little bit more, about why you think that holds kind of the most explanatory power in terms of describing what this might be. Or
so I'm willing to entertain that there may well be, and I'll even call them organisms, right? Living things in some sense on the earth that we have been aloof to for much of our history until humans sort of expanded our Umwelt in a way, or like literally went to new places and bumped into new things. And it seems to me like once you already begin with like the phenomenological, I would say, evidence for an Umwelt, not just presupposition and evidence for it, of an Umwelt, that entails that there is an Uber-Umwelt, which I think is a missed thing in phenomenology. If there's an Umwelt, there's got to be an Uber-Umwelt. And although I think maybe later Heidegger's into that, but anyway, but if there's an Umwelt, there's got to be an Uber-Umwelt. So then once again, it seems like we're not really asking ourselves to believe anything extravagant to say that there's stuff in the Uber-Umwelt that, because of our technological development, we're running into now. So it seems to me it's probabilistically very inexpensive just to take that as our default hypothesis, right? And then I do some rank metaphysical speculation in the rest of the book, okay, which is fine and fun. But where I would put my foot down is I do think the Uber-Umwelt Terrestrial Hypothesis is, I think, the most probabilistically economical, and I think phenomenologically like coherent with what the experiences report that's been put out so far. If I may be so bold, yeah.
No, I like it when someone's bold, kind of willing to put a foot down.
Yeah.
I mean, essentially, just for our listeners, it's just this idea that, whatever we're interacting with has actually just been here all along, and I think that actually is, because obviously there was an explosion kind of sightings after, 1947 and just in general after the, nuclear blasts. There was much more UFO activity, many more saucers were seen, much more interaction. But that isn't the beginning of the interaction, right?
Right.
That isn't the beginning of people seeing, kind of bumping into things that we don't quite know how to make sense of. And Vallée makes the point that the fairy folklore, that they used to have in Europe, a lot of those beings seem to act pretty similar to, the beings that we now associate with UFOs. And so, essentially you're making the claim that these beings have always been here and they evolved on Earth just like us. But for the most part, they're existing in our Uber-Umwelt. They're not accessible to our sensory experience. We are filtering them out. We're kind of like the tick in relation to them. We have the things around us that make sense and that we need to anchor ourselves in physical reality and that we need to survive. And there have always kind of been there in the Uber-Umwelt. But as we, expanded our technology, expanded our instruments, and we maybe even interfered, with the nuclear technology in the world in a way that potentially maybe even affected them, and that perhaps, brought about this flurry of activity and this flurry of contact. But we're not dealing with something that, came to us from millions of miles away. We're dealing with something that's kind of always just been right here, but we've been filtering it out.
Yep.
And
exactly.
then, I think that's a powerful statement. Like, like I said, I've kind of thought about this before as kind of like an interdimensional hypothesis, like maybe they're in a dimension that we're not really in. But I actually think the way that you framed it makes even more sense. It's not even about them being, unless you're just talking about dimensions as something, different layers of what we can sense and what we can't. But more simply, they're here with us in our dimension, but we're just our brains are filtering them out because they haven't really been, we haven't needed to interact with them. We haven't needed to, be able to sense them for our evolutionary needs.
So I'm going to say something else bold.
Okay.
On behalf of we phenomenological philosophers. Okay, so look, I mean, I don't think the Uber-Umwelt dichotomy is a hypothesis. I think it's a fact, and I think it's an unavoidable fact. And I don't, I don't know what it would be like. This is to be terrible for me to say this. What it would be like for us to be wrong about this, right? The fact that our perception works by narrowing the options for perception. Okay. You know what I mean? It seems to me like in I think you would agree with me, Kim, right? Like anyone who's done phenomenological investigation ends up with something like the equipmental environment is where we begin, right? Okay. The very notion of there being other dimensions of space and time is part of a verified thus far, but ultimately contingent and possibly, refuted scientific theory, right? I mean, so if we're going to account for UFOs as visitors from other dimensions of space and time, we're hooking our explanatory hypothesis to, what is essentially the science of the moment. Okay, and we know the science of the moment has a way of going away. Whereas I don't see the Uber-Umwelt versus Umwelt as simply our hooking ourselves to a contingent and probably a generation from now to be refuted scientific hypothesis. It seems that this is just a fact of how perception works. Okay, and so I think even it's close to the interdimensional kind of hypothesis, but I don't need to bet on specific scientific theories becoming part of a completed science if there ever could be such a thing. Whereas I think as like a necessary like result of any phenomenological investigation, I think that's a much better thing to hitch our wagon to, right? So I would say that we're even better off epistemologically going with this hypothesis than we would be going with something like the interdimensional stuff that even people like Vallée talk about. I mean, like, that's great, but you know what? That all could collapse with like the next good dissertation out of MIT, right?
I think that's a really powerful point, right? And I think you called it a fact, and I don't disagree with you. I think it's an inconvenient fact sometimes. Like I think that we like to assume that we're getting, when we look out our window, we're really seeing what's out there and not just seeing what our brain has filtered out that's relevant to us. But I think scientifically and phenomenologically, this is how perception works. Every organism filters out a considerable amount of what is there to only access what's relevant to it. And we've expanded what we have access to with our instruments and our technology, but we still don't, there could still be things that are considerably wide spectrum that we still don't even have access to with our instruments, right?
And I've had a hard time getting people to see this point, but I'm sure you'll dig. Is even our science, though, is relative to our Umwelt. Like ultimately, our scientific speaking of Husserl, the crisis of European sciences, here it is, right? Like all our instrumentation has to be like brought back to things that are accessible to the human five senses that we can put our eyes and hands and ears on in order for us to access it. So even our science is not getting us into the Uber-Umwelt. It's getting us maybe a broader, more sophisticated, more predictable, more technologically manipulable Umwelt, but it's not getting us to the Uber-Umwelt because ultimately that stuff, to have any empirical ground whatsoever, is got to always come back to human perception, and human perception is enabled by limitation.
100%. I think that's completely correct. Yeah. I mean, we so much now in modern society, we've really relied on science as the dominant authority for kind of defining the boundaries of the true and the real. And science has been very useful, and it does give us a lot of very important information, but I think you framed it absolutely correctly. It's giving us very useful information about our Umwelt. It can't, by definition, be giving us reliable information about what lies beyond it, because it's always has to come back into a format that we can interpret and make sense of it, right? Yeah. And there's so much out there that, we don't have access to through our Umwelt. We don't have access through our instruments, and whatever we do have access to through the instruments is ultimately going to have to come back and be processed through our categories of understanding and our senses. And so it's going to be a very limited piece of the whole picture, right? Or a piece of the whole puzzle of what's actually out there.
Those pieces may be real. They may be, I have no problem with that. None at all. However, there's going to be pieces that are always missing. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. It's a real piece of the puzzle, but it's small and it's specific to us. Exactly. So I just think being aware of this, right, when we're talking about, science and its value, and it is extremely valuable, but we also have to be cognizant of its limitations, right? It's giving us information about the Umwelt and information in ways that conforms to our senses and our categories of understanding.
This is something that I've found frustrating in the ufology world in some ways. Like on the one hand, there is this sort of knee-jerk metaphysically to move to idealism. I think there's also this knee-jerk scientism too, right? That there's just this assumption, that if this is going to be made sense of, it has to be made sense of scientifically, and then like a lot of ufologists will like, hey, if I can just sort of associate this with like quantum mechanics or, you know, multidimensional hypotheses, stuff like that, then that gives us permission to believe it. And we won't have that permission until it can be so associated, right? And once again, I think we're trading in like our already available cultural false dichotomies.
Yes, agreed. Right. There's definitely, and you know, this is among people who take UFOs seriously, right?
Yeah.
They're taking them very seriously, but they want to come up with a theory of reality that will explain them, right? And if they're coming from the Uber-Umwelt, they're not going to be comprehensible within any theory of reality that, again, is reduced to, or is intended to make sense just of our Umwelt, or is limited to making sense of our Umwelt. Yeah, very important point.
When we made a set to like so, the fact this is not something that can be theorized. It may be something that can be experienced, but it can't be theorized, right?
Right. And that's where the phenomenology of it comes in, right? It's something that's experienced, but at a theoretical level, we're not going to be able to theorize to you know, break that boundary of the Umwelt, Uber-Umwelt to have a coherent theory, other than to say that it's part of the Uber-Umwelt.
Yeah.
So on that note, the title of the book, you called it Unidentified Flying Hyperobject.
Yeah.
I was very interested when I saw that title. Tell our audience a little bit about what a hyperobject is and why you would think that this is kind of the ontological category that fits the UFO.
Yeah. So, okay, I'm taking the term hyperobject from an ecological thinker by the name of Tim Morton, who's a very interesting thinker, right? I don't know if he calls himself a philosopher. Right? I think he thinks it's funny that people think he's a philosopher, but Morton wrote a book called Hyperobjects. Okay, and it's coming out of the tradition of object-oriented ontology, and so I'll try not to go too far in explaining that. But like, so basically, just think of it though, as soon as we admit that there's an Uber-Umwelt, okay, there's this interesting question then of like, well, what's the cup I'm holding up really up to? It seems like it's much vaster than what I'm getting just in our Umwelt of this cup. Okay. And what Morton argues or suggests is that a hyperobject is an object where its total being that's in the Uber-Umwelt compared to the aspects of it that show up in the Umwelt is just vastly greater. Like we're just getting just the thinnest, you know, the sort of barely, you know, caricature of this object in the Umwelt. And what its real being is like far beyond that. Okay. And Morton thinks, and he makes a pretty good case, that phenomena like global warming or the economy, or another philosopher, Graham Harman, uses the example of civil war or the Pizza Hut Corporation, my favorite example, are actually hyperobjects, that they are vast objects operating on scales that far, far outstrip human abilities to understand them, and like our time scale, our spatial scales just don't really apply to these things. Okay, and now what's interesting is both Morton and Graham Harman see these hyperobjects as, in a way, ultra terrestrials. You know, they're not saying they're coming from another planet or something. They're saying these are things that have evolved here in a sense through ordinary earthly activities, and here they are showing up in uncanny ways to us. You know, we had a snow thunderstorm this year in Kansas. Okay, so that's pretty uncanny, right? So they're showing up to us in, you know, in thunder blizzards and things like this that are like very uncanny, very strange to us. Okay, and those uncanny appearances are just expressions of much vaster, larger terrestrial phenomena. Okay. Well, you can see then what I do there is like, well, then maybe indeed that's what the UFO is. Like what we're seeing with all these uncanny, don't quite fit a pattern phenomena are actually expressions of some grand systematic object that has evolved here on the earth. Okay. But note though, like I, as an organism, I am a grand systematic object in comparison to the cells in my body, in comparison to the DNA in my body. So it's sort of the idea is that like maybe indeed we are, interacting with vast organisms, and like what we're seeing here are empirically are merely expressions of them, and they don't make sense because they're taken out of the overall organic whole that they do make sense within. Do you see that? And what I find that's really interesting about Morton's suggestion is global warming is a hyperobject that we had a role in bringing about, not intentionally, but accidentally. So there's some stuff out there in the Uber-Umwelt. We start doing stuff in the Umwelt, and that has an effect out there. And next thing you know, you've got an interaction and a new object emerges. Okay. Well, likewise, we set off a nuclear bomb or two, we fly into space, we send out the first television waves that interacts with something out there, maybe fairies and goblins out there in the Uber-Umwelt. And now you have an interaction on a vast scale. Okay. And it makes sense when the manifestations of that show up in precision from the whole in which they make sense, that they wouldn't then make sense. Right. So that's the hyperobject part of the book. And that too, that's the rank speculation part of the book. Yeah.
So what does that mean in terms of our epistemic access, or just in terms of how really the hyperobject manifests in our lived experience? You kind of say I think the terminology you use in the book is we're only ever really getting at its edges. Yeah. And so what we're actually experiencing, I tend to think that one of the lessons is that we really can't generalize from any one individual account, because you're getting just like a very small piece of the whole picture. And then, yes, by all means, looking at more and more accounts and kind of see, what are potentially the patterns in the ways that this is showing up and the ways that we're experiencing this. And this will give us potentially some knowledge about our relationship to this object. Do we ever get to the point of having knowledge about the object itself, or is that forever kind of inaccessible to us?
Yeah, you're kind of getting into the moody Heideggerian turn the book takes. Yeah, right. And I'll admit, I'm kind of a grouchy middle-aged Heideggerian at times. Right? Okay. So I think I think there is an anti-humanism, not anti-human, but anti-humanism bend. There is such a bend in my book, and I think there is an anti-humanist bend to the phenomena. So, like, we're learning our Goldilocks ontology is not the measure of things. Okay. And I think you're asking, well, could we ever get to the inner life of the hyperobject? Okay. I'm going to say no, we can't. We can't. But that doesn't mean that the hyperobject couldn't show itself to us. Okay. So it seems to me, and I think what we were talking about earlier in terms of phenomenology and psychoanalysis and that sort of thing as a way of studying the phenomena, that's different from like traditional techno science that's going to take a hypothesis and throw it out there and see if the world fits it. Like we're not grasping at reality there. We are trying to do what we can to get out of the way so that we can listen to something else. Okay. So I don't think, and I think the idea of we're going to get a theory of it, or we're going to come to have knowledge in like the traditional sort of ontotheological sense of knowledge. I think that is to miss the very lesson that this all might have to teach us. But that doesn't mean that this thing couldn't reveal itself to us. It doesn't mean it might not be trying very hard to reveal itself to us right now, but we just haven't gotten out of our own way yet so that we can listen to it. Okay. So I do think that sort of later Heidegger attitude of like, we're going to make an abode where we can listen for something to show itself to us. I do think that is very useful in thinking about what I like how you put it, Kim, what our relationship to the phenomena should be, so that maybe if it does have something to teach us, we could hear it.
I was teaching a class last night on the phenomenology of UAP, and we were talking about Thomas Bulliard has this passage where he talks about the stories that we tell versus the stories that the UFOs or the UAP are telling. And he says so much of the discussion is just focused on the stories that we're telling about them, right? They're extraterrestrial. There's a government conspiracy. There's an abduction agenda. and so much of it is these kind of almost this myth that we have constructed around UFOs and what they are. But it's really, it's saying more about ourselves and our interpretation of what's going on than it's saying about the object itself.
Yes.
And so, what do we need to do to, create this, this space you're talking about where we can listen to what the UFO is saying? If it's, how do we flip that narrative and say, okay, we're going to tune out the noise, tune out the stories that we're telling, and listen to the story that the UFO is telling.
Yeah. Okay. This is gonna sound ironic because, but I'm going to say the first step is know thyself, right? Right. In the sense that we have to really articulate the human. Yeah, right. Right. We have to really get a sense of like what might be the static that we're putting over this. Okay. And that's where I do, once again, like phenomenology, anthropology, psychoanalysis, I think they're very important on that. So first things, I think we have to really know ourselves and know what are our weaknesses in interpretation, and like what because that's going to tell us what are the things that we might be hearing that we're refusing to hear, right? Like by like understanding ourselves better, we might get a sense of like what is it that we humans don't want to hear, okay? And that kind of gives us a sort of, check, right? Like then to really scan, is that very thing we don't want to hear, is that what's being presented here, right? I think in terms of inquiry, that's the best we can do.
No, I think that's very wise, right? I mean, and I've said before, like this, I think in a lot of ways, the conversation about UFOs is a conversation about us. We think it's a conversation about extraterrestrials, but it's really, it's kind of boiling down to, and I don't mean that in, like a very anthropocentric, we're the center of the universe type way. It's kind of decentering thinking about ourselves as the center of the universe, like kind of rupturing that assumption and like realizing all of reality doesn't revolve around us and our sensory experience, right? And really understanding our limitations in a way that will, if we understand our own limitations and we understand the, as I said, the stories and the narratives that we're kind of imposing onto it, maybe we make room to understand our relation to the rest of reality in a very different way, or just understand our relationship to, or just our general situation in the world in a way that's like more humble and also more realistic and more in tune with an understanding that there's a lot out there that we only see on the edges, right? We only get little glimpses of. And whatever glimpses we get of it, we're then organizing through, our own lenses, our own senses, and our own frameworks of interpretation.
Exactly. Yeah. I love how you put that, Kim. And like the very fact that there are, dino beavers and glowing raccoons showing up, okay, is, I think that should be a message of utter and complete humility. So, because that doesn't fit with our expectations. And so guess what? The world doesn't seem to care so much about our expectations.
Yes, exactly. The world does not care about our expectations. I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
So I guess, Jim, so I'll kind of put it out there. Is there anything that anything else that about this topic or this conversation, or anything else you discuss in the book that you'd like to put out there for our viewers or our listeners?
There's something that you alluded to just a couple minutes ago, Kim, that I thought is really important. Is you said of course we can we can talk about like disclosure and government conspiracy and all that stuff, right? But increasingly, I find all of that as a distraction. And I really do. And I think this idea that like there's these great secrets that need to be like made unsecret and stuff like that. Well, I mean, okay, fine. I mean, there's questions of like fairness and governance and stuff like that. Those are important questions. But you've mentioned, like, you've studied and taught quite a bit about Native American encounters with the supernatural, right? With the phenomenon, right? We don't need the revelation of what really goes on behind closed doors of the Pentagon to know that there's a phenomenon. Okay. And so I think that whole, I think the fact that the disclosure movement like got up and running in the New York Times and all that stuff, that helped because, like, it gave people like us permission to talk about this in ways. But I don't think we should see that as like that's the real issue. And I think a lot of ways, like those of us, especially in academia, just need to move on from all that and just like because we're talking. I think you and I would be in agreement. We're talking about the same phenomena that Native Americans were reporting for hundreds of years. That people in all sorts of religious traditions have been in the monotheistic traditions have been reporting for hundreds of years. And to go in for like I don't even like using the word UFO anymore, because it loads it into this ET narrative, and then now it's the question of like what's really in Area 51 and all that. And at the end of the day, I don't really care about that. I'm sure there's something weird at Area 51, whether or not there are aliens. Okay, of course there's something weird whether or not there's aliens, right? So for me, I just I'm finding myself like increasingly getting bored with that aspect of it, and more interested in these other things, and that we do seem to need, even though I don't like the word necessarily, the grand theory of the weird, and it goes so far beyond the nuts and bolts stuff that I kind of want to leave all that behind. Yeah.
No, I think that's a really important point, and I'm completely on the same page as you are. I'm not that interested in disclosure. Would I be surprised to learn that the government knew more about this than they were saying and have covered aspects of it up? No. Do I really care what they have? Not really, to be quite candid, because, I saw the hearings this summer, and, the whole discussion was framed in terms of, national security and existential threats and, new things for us to be afraid of. And, these were the experts because, I think so many people, want the government to come out and say that it's real, because that gives you, as you said, the permission to now take it seriously, and you're not a tinfoil hat wearer now if you're talking about it. But they're not the defining authorities about this. And as you've pointed out, we don't need their permission, and we don't need their whatever they may or may not be hiding to come to light to know that there's something here. I'm very interested in Native American encounters with, what we call the supernatural or paranormal. And that includes, they called them the sky people, the star people, right? They saw them in their crafts, and it very much interpreted them as, their ancestors, as having a shared evolutionary history with them. And they have kind of their own interpretations, but they've been interacting with them for centuries, and people all over the world, experiencers all over the world, basically in every culture, have been reporting interaction with this phenomenon for centuries. And there was an explosion in our modern culture in the past 7 or 8 decades, and there's an ample amount, there's enough there. If we look at the experiences that people are having, we don't need the government to come out with, again, the smoking gun of whatever they've got in Area 51. Maybe they have crafts, maybe they have biologics, but I'm like you, I'm not so much interested in that. And I think it's a giant distraction, right? I think that there's plenty for us, as just, philosophers and academics in general, there's plenty here for us to work with, whatever the government is doing or whatever's going on with disclosure. I'm very much on the same page as you that those questions don't much interest me. I'm really interested in the lived experiences that people have with this phenomenon, and as we've uncovered here today, trying to listen to what the UFOs are saying and create a framework of inquiry where we are listening.
Exactly. And with the whole disclosure thing too, there's this sort of liar's paradox just over the hill with that. I mean, so on the one hand, not exactly liar's paradox, but something similar. So on the one hand, I like to talk about the David Grush dilemma. Okay, so if like what David Grush testifies to is true, or like what he testifies as having been told is true, right? It's not about whether he's been told something true. Well, if that's true, then that's pretty crazy, because then like the X-Files is true, right? I mean, like the whole, like Roswell, the Vatican had UFOs, all that's true. That's a very big revelation. But if what he's saying isn't true, then that means there's people who want us to believe the X-Files is true, and I think that's equally just is uncanny too. Do you know what I mean? So either way, we're stuck now. Like, you're going to have to believe. You need a conspiracy theory either way. Do you know what I mean? But then that raises this other problem. Like, okay, so let's say someone comes out and says, yeah, everything that David Grush said is true, right? Some authority comes out. Well, it's then that someone saying, yeah, we've been lying to you for 80 years about this, but now we're telling the truth. Well, I'm not in a position to trust anymore. Do you know what I mean? So it seems to me the whole disclosure thing, it is the hall of mirrors. There's just no way through those epistemic waters. So for me, I'm moving on, and I want to talk about the metaphysics of this thing, or in the phenomenology of the thing, in the psychoanalysis of this thing.
Yeah, and I understand for some experiencers who, they were discredited, they were delegitimized, they were stigmatized, they were told that they were crazy. I understand why the idea of the government coming out and saying that it's real can hold a lot of weight, for that aspect of it, specifically for people who have just been, really discredited. And we want to, so I understand that concern, but in terms of like the epistemic and the philosophical questions that are at play here, and as you said, the metaphysical questions, I don't think that whatever the government knows or doesn't know is the key defining issue here, right? Yeah. And I think that we can create ways to validate and legitimize experiencers without the government credibility either. We can do it, in terms of academic spaces and, the ways that we take experiencer testimony seriously and let it play a role in the